This is Jason Marquette from the Institute for Strategic Negotiations. In just a minute, we will hear some critical insights on negotiating with Goliaths. But before that, I just want to mention a few things about the Institute for Strategic Negotiations. The Institute for Strategic Negotiations offers the world's largest library of negotiating courses for business executives. The Institute for Strategic Negotiations certification programs offer concentrations in the areas of negotiating intellectual property agreements, negotiating commercial transactions, international negotiations, commercial real estate negotiating, corporate negotiations, and negotiating commercial funding agreements. The Institute for Strategic Negotiations offers open enrollment courses as well as customized negotiating courses that can be delivered directly to your group at your facilities. We invite you to join the hundreds of successful executives who are adding the Institute for Strategic Negotiations Certified Negotiator designation to their resumes. Let the Institute for Strategic Negotiations help boost your business and your career. Visit us at www.instituteforstrategicnegotiations.com. Now, let's observe as David Wanatic shares a few invaluable strategies to consider when negotiating with Goliaths.
All right, so earlier today we spoke about a number of strategies for negotiating with Goliaths. And I want to talk to you about a couple more strategies you can employ to negotiate with Goliaths. One is to remove valuable players from the opposing team. A couple of methods you can use to try to displace valuable players from the opposing team are the sit down, conflicting them out, and running out the clock. What I mean by a sit down, this is actually a term that the mafia uses to denote when different factions of a family have a dispute. They ask the head of the family for a sit down and try to resolve the disputes at that point. But anyway, a sit down in our context means that you call a senior person at the opposing company and you tell them that the negotiator that has been appointed to negotiate with you at their company is not qualified. They're not up to speed. They're not professional. They're slowing down the negotiation. They're jeopardizing the negotiation. So you try to get them removed from the negotiating table. Another thing is to try to conflict out aggressive players on the other side. And one way to do that is to try to determine some conflict that they may have. So if you do your due diligence and you determine that their spouse works for your company or a subsidiary of your company or their employment history is such that there may be a conflict, and having them sit at that negotiation, you can conflict out an aggressive negotiator on the other side. And the third strategy along this line of thought is to run out the clock. So if I'm negotiating against somebody that's extremely aggressive, and I really would want to negotiate with somebody that's more amiable, and I know that the aggressive negotiator is going to go on a sabbatical or leave the company or going to be reassigned to a different department in 3 months, I would maybe stall the negotiation and just run out the clock, and then eventually the successor will be less aggressive than that current negotiator. Another strategy to deal with Goliaths is to accentuate your weakness. And this sounds illogical, but there's a negotiating tactic called Damsel in distress, which is when a negotiator plays up their weakness. A negotiator says something to the effect that this is my first negotiation, I'm just out of school, or I have been negotiating for a while, but not on this deal. I was just thrown on this deal last night. I don't really know everything that has transpired the last couple months that the negotiating has been taking place. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to prompt the other side not to use all their strength and power against you in the negotiation. That's called a damsel in distress. Another thing to realize is that when you're negotiating against a Goliath, large companies, large entities cannot do whatever they want. Everybody is bound by laws and regulations and company policy and precedent and industry standards and codes of conduct, that kind of thing. And what you need to do if you're in a position of weakness negotiating against a Goliath is to invoke a higher power to reduce the other side's leverage. So one thing that we have done at the Institute for Strategic Negotiations is that when we run webinars and we determine that people are violating the rights to our webinars, we let them know that they're actually depriving the Internal Revenue Service of revenue because they're infringing the copyrights. and basically let them know that we could inform the IRS that their infringement is costing the government money. And so the government has much more leverage than a small company. So that's an example of invoking higher authorities to gain more leverage against a Goliath. The other authority you really want to invoke is the other side's own words. In negotiations, you always want to use the other side's words against them. Ronald Reagan did this very effectively when he was negotiating arms limitations with Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan would always say, "Trust but verify, trust but verify." Well, this was actually a Russian proverb. And Gorbachev was getting annoyed when Reagan continued to say, "Trust but verify," but Gorbachev couldn't really say anything about that since it was a Russian proverb. Another idea to invoke is when you're negotiating against a giant is to use their own mass against them, to try to create pressure inside of their organization to change their behavior, to change their negotiating stance. So a good example of this, in effect, goes back to 1995 when Shell UK wanted to dispose of the Brent spar in the Atlantic Ocean. The Brent spar was an oil storage tanker, and they wanted to dispose of that in the Atlantic Ocean. Greenpeace was opposed to that. Well, Greenpeace wasn't that strong in the UK. They weren't that well organized. They didn't have tremendous support in the UK. So what Greenpeace did was they lobbied and caused protests and strikes and disrupted business for the German operations of Shell. And so what happened was Shell in Germany was not performing so well because they were affected by these strikes and protests and so forth. So what happened was the German executives of Shell put pressure on their British counterparts to change the policy vis-a-vis disposing of the Brent spar. So try to foment internal pressure on the target organization. Another idea comes from President Truman. President Truman was quoted as saying that if you can't convince, confuse. If you can't convince, confuse. So the idea here is one way you can get power over a dominant or a domineering authority is to simply confuse them, overwhelm them. And this actually happens in the UK. Just a bit of background, the United Kingdom has the shortest period of transition of any democratic country in the world. Assuming that the new prime minister has won a parliamentary majority, he will assume power the morning after the election without even the benefit of a night's sleep. So how do the British civil servants welcome in the new prime minister on his first day in office? They bombard the new prime minister with lots and lots of briefs that demand the prime minister's attention. Now, some of these briefs deal with pretty routine governmental affairs, but some of them are extremely important. Some of them determine how Britain's nuclear submarines are to be managed if the prime minister is assassinated. Instructions for managing Britain's nuclear arsenal are among the briefs that are pushed towards the new prime minister his first day in office. And I'd just like to quote something from a very good book entitled The New Machiavelli. This was a book written by Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff for many years. So Jonathan Powell says, these kinds of decisions should not be thrust upon a new prime minister who has not slept properly for a week. The cabinet secretary's objective in doing so is to seek to overwhelm the new prime minister with decisions and put him in awe of his responsibilities so that he comes to depend on the Mandarin as his guide. So the lesson with this story is back to Truman's quote that if you can't convince, at least confuse. Another way to deal with domineering people in your career is to give them credit, to never outshine the master. Sometimes, if you want to gain power from a Goliath, you must yield to them the glory of your accomplishments. And we can look at two very different situations. We can look at Tim Cook at Apple Computer and Carolyn Kepcher, who was with the Trump Organization. Tim Cook, for many years, was the chief operating officer of Apple Computer, And when Steve Jobs had to take his sick leaves, Tim Cook stepped in and performed the duties of the CEO. And Tim Cook was often asked, do you envision yourself one day becoming the CEO of Apple Computer? And Tim Cook was always very reverential towards Steve Jobs. He venerated Steve Jobs. And he would always say things like, nobody can ever take the place of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is going to be here when he's in his 70s, his 80s. He's going to be here long after I'm gone. So he always gave credit to his master. Now we can look at the difference in that behavior versus Carolyn Kepcher and Donald Trump. Carolyn Kepcher was a senior executive to Donald Trump, and she appeared in the first year's series of the show The Apprentice. She was the lady that appeared in the first series of the Apprentice. And The Apprentice was a very popular show in the beginning, and Carolyn Kepcher was becoming popular in her own right. She was getting a lot of media attention. She published a book, she was speaking at different events, and she was gaining quite attraction herself. Well, she started to violate the rule of never outshining your master. And as a result, she was terminated from the Trump organization. The last idea I want to share with you as far as dealing with Goliaths is one way to handle an executive, a CEO or your boss, when you think they're about to make a mistake, is to exaggerate their position and make the position look ludicrous. So in talking about this issue, perhaps negotiators can modify a doctrine adhered to by architects. Architects are taught that when they make a mistake, the best remedy is to accentuate the mistake. So when your Goliath is about to make a mistake, maybe you want to exaggerate their position so that they will see the folly of their own logic. Now, an example of this goes back to World War II. In preparations for the invasion of Normandy, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill told his military staff that he wanted to accompany the first wave of soldiers that would attack the Normandy beach. Well, obviously this was a ludicrous idea, given Churchill's his age, his position, his physical condition, and the fact that the expectations were that somewhere around 80% of the soldiers would be at least wounded, if not killed, in the initial invasion force. Well, anyway, the senior British military authorities tried to talk Churchill out of his accompanying the soldiers on the first wave of attack. Appealing to Churchill's common sense didn't work. Then the military commanders enlisted the support of Mrs. Churchill. They tried to get her to talk Winston Churchill out of this notion of joining the soldiers on the attack at Normandy Beach. That, unfortunately, did not work either. Churchill was still adamant about wanting to join the soldiers on the initial invasion of Normandy. So finally what happened was the British military high command enlisted the support of King George VI. And King George VI summoned Winston Churchill to the king's office, and the king said, I want you to do me a favor. And Winston Churchill said, sure, what can I do for you? And the king said, I want you to make provisions for me, the king, to also join the first wave of attack at Normandy. And what happened was, in Churchill's mind, he thought, well, this is completely preposterous. The king can't possibly be on the front lines of the attack at Normandy. But when he was thinking that way, it also became apparent that Churchill's own logic for his joining the initial attack at Normandy was also an illogical idea.
To join an open enrollment course, earn your negotiating designation, or to schedule custom negotiations training for your organization, contact us at the Institute for Strategic Negotiations, 609-919-1895, extension 100, or email us at info@bdacademy.com.